Forget everything you think you know about sex in the Wild West. Forget the Hollywood fantasy. Forget the smoldering gunslinger with a heart of gold, leaning against the saloon bar, sharing a meaningful glance with the beautiful, witty prostitute who's just waiting for him to rescue her from her tragic life. Forget the coy smiles, the playful banter over a glass of whiskey, the slow, romantic fade to black as he carries her up a grand, carpeted staircase. That's a lie. It's a comfortable, perfumed, cinematic lie we tell ourselves because the truth is too foul to put on a movie poster. The reality was a frantic, clumsy, and often disgusting transaction conducted in filth and desperation. It was less about smoldering romance and more about the urgent biological need to expel a bodily fluid, preferably without catching another, more permanent one. It was about men who hadn't washed in weeks, their bodies a roadmap of trail dust, sweat, and loneliness, fumbling in the dark with women who were just as desperate, just as trapped, and whose primary professional goal was to get it over with as quickly as possible. The soundtrack wasn't a sweeping orchestral score, it was the creak of a flimsy bed, the muffled grunts of exertion, and the frantic splashing of cloudy water in a ceramic basin afterward. It was a world where lust wasn't a smouldering ember, but a raw, itching sore. A world where intimacy was a commodity sold by the minute, and the only thing being rescued was a man's urgent physical pressure for a price. The air wasn't thick with romantic tension. It was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, stale cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet, cloying odor of decay. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a brutal, sweaty, and often fatal business, and we're going to crawl right into the grimy, sticky center of it. Hang on, before we start oozing through the grime of the past, I need to know who's in quarantine with me. Tell me in the comments where you're isolating and what time it is. I want to picture your clean, modern surroundings before we get disgusting. Ready to feel sick? Let's begin. The pre-ritual, the preparation for this grand symphony of squalor, was a performance of its own, a sad, meticulous prologue to a very short play. For the woman, the soiled dove, as the quaint, sanitized histories like to call her, the day began and ended with water. Not clean water, mind you. Water was a precious thing, not to be wasted on something as trivial as hygiene. We're talking about a basin of lukewarm, slightly greasy water, used and reused until it was more of a human soup than a cleaning agent. The primary tool of her trade, besides her own body, was the syringe. Not a sterile, disposable medical device, but a fearsome-looking metal or glass contraption, a veteran of countless internal campaigns. This was her shield, her pathetic, unreliable armor against the twin terrors of conception and disease. Into it went a caustic cocktail of chemicals that would make a modern chemist weep. Carbolic acid, Lysol, potassium permanganate, zinc sulfate, even bichloride of mercury. These were things you used to strip paint or disinfect a slaughterhouse floor, and they were being deployed into the most sensitive tissues of the human body. The goal wasn't gentle cleansing, it was a scorched earth policy. The burn was a sign it was working. The internal irritation, the raw, inflamed tissue, was just the cost of doing business. Imagine the quiet, methodical dread of that act performed multiple times a day, every day. The cold metal, the sharp chemical sting, the knowledge that this protection was itself a poison, slowly eroding her from the inside out. This was her private communion, a moment of grim self-care that was actually self-harm. Then came the mask. The face she presented to the world was a lie painted in lead and mercury. The popular arsenic complex wafers promised a delicate, pale complexion, a sign of genteel femininity, while literally poisoning the user from within. The rouge for her cheeks and lips was often lead-based, a heavy, toxic paste that seeped into her pores. The kohl for her eyes was just as likely to cause blindness as it was to be alluring. She was painting a target on her face with poison, a beautiful death mask to entice men who would pay to witness her slow, professional decay. She'd check her teeth, maybe rub them with a bit of soot or salt if she was feeling fancy, hoping to hide the rot. She'd hoist herself into a corset, a cage of whalebone and canvas that rearranged her organs into a more fashionable shape, making every breath a shallow, calculated effort. Every step of this preparation was a reminder of her station. She was a product, and a product has to be packaged, even if the packaging is toxic and the contents are screaming. It was a ritual of self-erasure, of transforming a living, breathing, hurting woman into an object of temporary, purchasable lust. The anxiety wasn't just about the next client. It was a low, constant thrum of bodily terror. Is this the day the chemical burns become an infection? Is this the day a sore appears that won't go away? Is the ache in my gut from the corset the poison or something growing in there? This wasn't backstage jitters. This was the daily calculus of a slow-motion suicide. For the man, the cowboy, the miner, the traveling salesman, the preparation was a simpler, more brutish affair. It was primarily alcoholic. The ritual began at the saloon bar, pouring courage and recklessness down his throat in the form of cheap, raw whiskey that tasted like fire and regret. He wasn't preparing for intimacy, he was preparing for a transaction, and like any nervous buyer, he needed to blunt his senses. He'd worked for weeks, maybe months, out on the plains or deep in a mine, a celibate, lonely, grinding existence. The money in his pocket felt heavy, a physical manifestation of his pent-up frustration. This wasn't about connection, it was about release. It was a biological imperative, as urgent and unromantic as needing to take a piss. He wasn't looking for a soulmate, he was looking for a receptacle. There might be a moment of consideration, a quick glance in a dirty mirror, a futile attempt to slick down hair with a bit of spit or pomade, maybe a splash of water on the face, more to wake himself up than to get clean. Why bother? Cleanliness was an alien concept. He was layered in the evidence of his labor, the dust of a cattle drive, the grime of a coal seam, the sweat of a man who lived in his own clothes. His preparation was about building up a head of steam, a sense of entitlement. He had earned this. The loneliness, the back-breaking work, the sheer emptiness of his life, it all translated into a hard-edged conviction that he was owed this small, paid-for slice of oblivion. The negotiation would be slurred and blunt, a crude haggling over time and services, stripped of all poetry. How much for a quick go? What do I get for $1? There was no courtship, no illusion of romance. It was business. His anxiety was of a different sort. The fear of being cheated, of paying for a bad time, the low-grade paranoia that came with being drunk in a strange place. And beneath it all, the same cold dread that haunted the woman. Disease. He'd heard the stories, seen the men with the weeping sores, the slow, shuffling gaits, the minds eaten away by the pox. But the whiskey and the weeks of celibacy usually shouted louder than that quiet, prudent voice. His preparation was a willful act of forgetting, a drunken lunge toward a moment of release that he hoped wouldn't come with a lifetime of rot. He was getting ready to pay for a moment of pleasure, and in a world so short on it, the potential cost seemed, in the hazy, drunken moment, like a risk worth taking. The two rituals, one of chemical self-assault and painted illusion, the other of alcoholic bravado and earned entitlement, were two sides of the same tarnished coin. They were both about preparing a body for an act that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the grim, grinding mechanics of survival and release in a world that offered little else. The curtain was about to rise on a stage set for mutual exploitation, and both actors, in their own pathetic ways, were ready for their parts. They were building a bridge of desperation across a chasm of loneliness, and the toll was paid in cash, flesh, and a little bit of soul every single time. It was a meticulous descent into a shared, temporary hell, and the first step was always convincing yourself you belonged there. The air itself was a character in this sordid drama, a thick, almost chewable antagonist. Forget the sweeping vistas of the prairie. The real Wild West was an indoor sport, played out in cramped, suffocating spaces that were designed for maximum profit and minimum comfort. Let's start with the crib, the bottom rung of the prostitution ladder. This wasn't a room, it was a box. A narrow, windowless shack, often no bigger than a large closet, with just enough space for a bed and perhaps a small stand with a basin. These cribs were lined up in rows, forming the grim arteries of the red light district, each one a tiny, self-contained theatre of misery. The walls were thin, unpainted planks offering zero privacy. Every grunt, every sigh, every creak of the bed springs from the neighboring crib was part of the ambient soundtrack. The architectural philosophy was pure, uncut capitalism. Pack as many transactions into as small a space as possible. There was no decoration, no attempt at creating a welcoming atmosphere. The message was clear: this is not a place to linger. Get in, get it done, get out. The smell, oh God, the smell. It was a complex symphony of human despair. The dominant note was unwashed bodies, a sour animal tang of stale sweat and grime. Layered on top of that was the sharp, antiseptic smell of carbolic acid and lye from the perpetual, inadequate douching. Then came the cheap, cloying perfume the women used to try and mask it all, a floral sweetness that didn't cover the rot but mingled with it to create something uniquely nauseating. Add to that the reek of stale whiskey, vomit, and cigar smoke clinging to the unvarnished wood, and the faint, underlying scent of mildew and decay from the damp floorboards. To breathe in a crib was to inhale a gaseous history of every sad, desperate encounter that had happened within its four walls. The lighting was deliberately terrible. A single smoky oil lamp or a stub of a candle would cast long, dancing shadows, turning faces into grotesque masks and hiding the worst of the stains on the sheets and walls. This wasn't for ambiance, it was a practical matter. The dimness was a mercy, a veil drawn over the grim reality of the transaction, making it easier for both parties to pretend the other was something they were not. It hid the pockmarks on a man's face and the exhaustion in a woman's eyes. In this flickering gloom, you didn't have to fully see the person you were paying or the person you were servicing. You just had to see enough. The tools of the trade were as grim as the environment. The bed was the centerpiece, a rickety wooden frame with a mattress that defied the very concept of comfort. It wasn't filled with soft down or cotton. It was stuffed with lumpy, compressed straw or corn husks that rustled and poked with every movement. The sheets, if they existed, were a greyish, coarse linen, changed infrequently and bearing a spectral map of previous encounters. More often than not, a simple, oilcloth-covered pad was used for easy clean-up, cold and slick against the skin, a constant reminder of the purely functional nature of the act. Beside the bed, the washstand held the other essential tools. The ceramic basin and pitcher, both likely chipped, contained the murky, all-purpose water. Next to it, a bar of harsh, lye-heavy soap that would strip the hide off a mule. And of course, the syringe, lying there like a retired torture device. There might be a bottle of cheap whiskey, not for the client, but for the woman, a tool for numbing the mind as much as the douche was for numbing the body. The lead-based makeup pot sat nearby, its contents a toxic sludge. These weren't accoutrements of pleasure, they were the instruments of a grueling, repetitive job. Each object told a story of use and reuse, of bodily fluids and chemical warfare, of a desperate battle to maintain a sliver of hygiene in an overwhelmingly filthy world. Moving up the ladder, you had the saloon back room. A step up, but only just. At least here, you might have a proper door. But the sounds of the saloon, the tinny piano, the shouting, the breaking glass, bled through the walls, a constant, chaotic reminder of the world of men just on the other side of the flimsy partition. The smell was much the same, with a heavier emphasis on stale beer and sawdust. The advantage here was proximity to the customer base, but it came at the cost of being an extension of the bar, a human toilet for the drunken patrons. The environment reinforced the power dynamics with brutal clarity. The crib's tight, claustrophobic space gave the illusion of privacy but was, in fact, a cage. The woman was trapped, her back literally against the wall. The transaction was swift and impersonal because the space itself demanded it. The saloon room was a clear statement of her place in the hierarchy. She was part of the saloon's amenities, listed somewhere below the whiskey and above the spittoons. The entire environment was designed to dehumanize and commodify. The lack of comfort, the filth, the smells, it all served to strip the act of any potential for human connection. It was a factory floor for lust, and the women were the machinery. The symbolism was unavoidable. The thin walls represented the porous barrier between her professional life and public shame. The murky water was the polluted well of her own health. The lumpy mattress was the uncomfortable reality on which her survival rested. This wasn't a boudoir, it was a battleground, a filthy, stinking, poorly lit battleground where the only currency was cash and the only victory was getting through the night without bleeding, weeping, or catching something that would kill you. And tomorrow, you'd wake up and do it all over again, in the same box, with the same smells, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 other joyless, frantic couplings. It wasn't a home. It was a tomb you rented by the hour. In this squalid theatre, power was the director, the producer, and the scriptwriter. And the figure looming over it all, the true authority in this ecosystem of exploitation, was rarely the woman herself. Forget the myth of the savvy, independent madam running her own ship with an iron fist and a heart of gold. While some of those existed, they were the exception, the rare apex predators in a food chain built on chewing up and spitting out the weak. More often, the power was held by a man, a blunt, unsentimental businessman for whom these women were just another column in a ledger. Meet the saloon owner. He was the king of this small, stinking castle. He owned the building, he sold the liquor that fueled the client's courage, and he managed the women who worked the rooms upstairs or in the cribs out back. He was a master of coercive economics. A woman didn't just rent a room from him. She was ensnared in a web of debt that was impossible to escape. He charged her for her board, for her food at an inflated price, for the whiskey she was encouraged to push on clients, for the laundry service that barely cleaned her sheets, even for medical checkups by a quack doctor who was on his payroll. Every dollar she earned had his name on it before it even touched her hand. He was her landlord, her employer, her banker, and her jailer, all rolled into one. His hypocrisy was breathtaking. He might be a respected town figure, a man who sits on the town council and donates to the church bake sale, presenting himself as a pillar of the community. He sells the dream of civilization and progress, while his entire business model is based on profiting from the most primal, desperate acts of its citizens. He is the ultimate parasite, feeding on the loneliness of the men and the desperation of the women, and laundering the profits into a veneer of respectability. His power was absolute and brutally enforced. A woman who tried to hold back money, who refused a particularly odious client, or who simply talked back, would face swift consequences. A beating was a common management tool, a painful reminder of who was in charge. Or he could simply fine her, adding another layer of debt to her already impossible burden. The most effective weapon in his arsenal was the threat of casting her out. A woman with a reputation, no money, and no protection was as good as dead. He knew it, and she knew it, so she played by his rules. His detachment was his greatest strength. He didn't see these women as people, he saw them as assets, depreciating assets at that. A young, healthy woman was a prime investment. One who got sick, pregnant, or old was a liability to be discarded. He would watch them waste away from disease, alcoholism, or despair with the same dispassionate eye a rancher might watch a cow sicken and die. It was just the cost of doing business. The institutional authority was just as complicit. The town marshal or sheriff wasn't a force for justice. He was a partner in the enterprise. He was paid off, either in cash or in free services, to look the other way. Raids were rare, and usually for show, a bit of public theatre to appease the town's moral faction. More often, the law was a tool of the saloon owner. If a woman tried to run, the sheriff would bring her back. If a client got violent, the law would likely take the man's side unless he'd done permanent, business-damaging harm to the property. The legal system was designed to protect property and commerce, and in this context, the woman was the product being sold, not the citizen being protected. Then there was the social code, the unwritten law that was more powerful than any man with a badge. This code dictated that a fallen woman was permanently stained. There was no path back to respectable society. She was a necessary evil, a pressure valve for male lust that protected the good women of the town from assault. Society needed her, used her, and despised her for it. This hypocrisy was the bedrock on which the whole system was built. The men who visited her at night would ignore her on the street the next day. The wives of those men would cross the street to avoid her, whispering about her filth while their husbands were the source of it. This social shunning was a powerful cage, trapping her in the life as surely as any locked door. So who held the power? The man with the money and the ledger. The man with the badge and the blind eye. And the silent, crushing judgment of the very society she serviced. The woman in the crib had only one sliver of power, the power to say yes to the transaction in front of her. But it was a hollow choice, the choice between earning enough to eat today or starving, the choice between this client or the next one, the choice between a quick, humiliating act or a slow, humiliating death. It wasn't agency. It was the illusion of agency, a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane of economic and social force. The authority figure wasn't just a person, it was the entire structure, a pyramid of exploitation with the woman's body as its foundation and her shame as the mortar holding it all together. He watched her from the saloon floor, counting his money, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. He was selling sin, and business was booming. Before a single hand was laid on flesh, before the sour breath of a stranger filled the cramped space of the crib, a war was being fought in the minds of the participants. The psychological landscape of this encounter was a treacherous terrain of superstition, warped faith, and desperate justifications. It was a world where the body was a mystery, disease was a divine punishment, and the soul was a commodity that could be tarnished, pawned, and perhaps, if you were lucky, redeemed. For the woman, her internal world was a fortress built to withstand a constant siege. Religion, for many, offered a strange and contradictory framework. She was living in a state of perpetual sin, a fact she was reminded of by the church bells that pealed on Sunday morning while she was trying to sleep off the Saturday night rush. Yet she might still cling to a sliver of faith. A desperate prayer whispered before a particularly rough-looking client entered her room. "God, get me through this. God, don't let him hurt me. God, don't let me get sick." It was a foxhole religion, born of terror and desperation. The act itself was a sin, but survival was a necessity. She might try to compartmentalize to believe that her soul remained pure, even as her body was defiled. "This is not me," she would tell herself. "This is a thing I do to live. My real self is somewhere else, untouched." This psychological split was a crucial survival mechanism, a way to create an internal sanctuary that the filth of her profession could not penetrate. Or she could lean into the sin, adopting a cynical, damned if I do, damned if I don't philosophy. If she was already going to hell, why not be comfortable on the way down? This dark bravado was another form of armor, a way of owning her damnation, of turning a scarlet letter into a badge of defiance. Superstition and folk medicine were far more present and powerful than any formal theology. The world was full of unseen forces and malevolent spirit, and the body was a porous vessel, vulnerable to all of them. A rabbit's foot might be tucked under her pillow, a charm to ward off bad luck or a violent client. She might have a whole personal pharmacopoeia of folk remedies for female troubles, passed down from other women in the trade. A particular herb to bring on a late period, a poultice to soothe the burn of the chemical douches, a specific prayer to be recited if she thought she'd been exposed to the pox. These beliefs were a desperate attempt to exert some control over a body that was fundamentally not her own, a body subject to the whims of clients, the ravages of disease, and the ignorance of 19th century medicine. She believed that a man's seed could carry not just a baby, but his character, his bad luck, his sins. The act was a transference of more than just fluid. It was a psychic contamination she had to ritually cleanse herself of afterward. The splash of the water in the basin was as much about washing away his spiritual grime as it was about physical hygiene. Her psychological justification was simple and brutal. This is a job. She was a tradeswoman, and her body was her workshop. She developed a professional detachment, a 1,000-yard stare that allowed her to be physically present while her mind was miles away. She would count cracks in the ceiling, plan what she'd buy with the money, or mentally compose a letter to a family back home who thought she was working as a seamstress. This emotional numbness was her most valuable skill, the one that allowed her to endure the endless parade of anonymous, grasping bodies. It was a form of self-hypnosis, a daily practice of becoming an object. The terror was that the numbness might fail, that a moment of unexpected cruelty, or, even more dangerously, unexpected kindness, could shatter the wall and let the full horror of her situation flood in. For the cowboy or the miner, the internal monologue was a different kind of fiction. His justification was rooted in a sense of rugged, masculine entitlement. I earned this. The long, hard months of brutal celibate labor were a deposit in a bank of suffering, and tonight he was making a withdrawal. He saw it as a fair trade, his hard-earned cash for her time. He wasn't hurting anyone, he'd tell himself. It's an honest business transaction. He conveniently ignored the power imbalance, the desperation that drove her to this trade, the filth, the disease. His psychological work was to reduce her to a function, a service provider. She wasn't a person with a history and fears, she was the whore, a category, not an individual. This dehumanization was essential. It allowed him to engage in an act of profound intimacy without any of the emotional entanglement or responsibility that true intimacy requires. His religious beliefs were often a matter of convenience. He might feel a pang of guilt, a flicker of the fire and brimstone sermons of his youth, but it was quickly extinguished by whiskey and raw need. He could always confess later, or make a donation to the church, or simply believe that God understood that a man had certain needs. His God was a masculine God, a God who understood the trials of men in a hard land. Sin was for Sundays. Saturday night was for sinning. His superstitions were more practical. He might fear the bad women, the ones rumored to be riddled with disease, and seek out the clean houses based on saloon gossip and rumor. He might carry his own talismans for luck, not just at the card table but in the bedroom. He feared the pox with a primal terror, but his fear of loneliness and his biological urges were more immediate. He performed a kind of magical thinking. It won't happen to me. He was strong. He was lucky. He was different from the pathetic, shuffling men he'd seen wasting away. This encounter was a necessary part of his mythos, the story he told himself about his life. He was a free man, a master of his own destiny, and that included the freedom to buy a woman's body when he felt like it. It was a confirmation of his virility, his success, his power in a world that mostly made him feel small and powerless. The brief, paid-for dominion he had in that crib was a tonic for a life of being ordered around by bosses, by the weather, by the whims of cattle. In that small room, for a few minutes, he was the king. And so these two carefully constructed psychological fortresses would meet. Her armor of detachment against his armor of entitlement. Her prayers for survival against his rationalizations for use. They were both lying to themselves, telling stories that made the ugly, transactional reality palatable. The room was not just filled with two bodies, it was filled with their ghosts, their fears, their justifications, and the great yawning chasm of what they couldn't or wouldn't allow themselves to feel. The first touch was a lie, a collision of two fictions in the suffocating dark. The transaction has been made, the justifications have been rehearsed, and the door to the tiny, stinking room has closed. This is it, the first point of contact. Forget any notion of a gentle caress or a tender exploration. The initial moment was a shock to the system, a blunt, clumsy collision that shattered any lingering illusions of control or romance. It was the moment the grim reality of the exchange became physically, unavoidably present. Imagine the man, fueled by cheap whiskey and weeks of pent-up frustration, stumbling into the near-total darkness. His movements are not graceful. They are a bull in a china shop ballet of drunken urgency. He might trip on the uneven floorboards, lurching forward, catching himself on the flimsy bed frame. The first thing that hits him is the smell, up close and personal. The cloying perfume can no longer mask the sour human reality of the woman lying on the bed, nor the sharp chemical tang of her hygiene. It's an intimate animal smell, the smell of a body that is also a workplace, and it's a stark, sobering slap in the face. His first touch is not a lover's touch, it's a grab. A rough, possessive seizing of a shoulder, an arm, a breast. It's the touch of a man who has paid for a product and is now checking the merchandise. It says, "You are mine for the next 10 minutes." There is no tenderness in it, only impatience. He is a man on a schedule, a tight, ticking clock of lust that is about to expire. He fumbles with his own clothing, the complicated buttons and braces of 19th century trousers, cursing under his breath. The whole process is awkward, graceless, and stripped of any dignity. For the woman, this is the moment her mental fortress is tested. She has braced herself, her body rigid under the thin sheet, waiting for the inevitable impact. The first shock is his smell. The stale sweat, the trail dust, the raw whiskey on his breath. It's an invasion of her personal space, a violation before the main event has even begun. She has to force herself not to recoil. His touch is a familiar violence, the rough grip of a stranger who sees her not as a person, but as an object to be used. Her skin crawls, but her face remains a blank mask. This is the job. She has to endure the initial clumsiness, the fumbling, the weight of his body as he collapses onto the lumpy mattress beside or on top of her. The first kiss, if it can be called that, is a wet, sloppy assault. It's not a meeting of lips, but a crushing of mouths, his whiskey-sour tongue forcing its way in, a brutish claiming of territory. She endures it, her mind a million miles away, counting the seconds, calculating how much longer this will take. The initial contact is a cacophony of unpleasant sensations. The scratch of his unshaven face against her skin, raw from the lead-based makeup. The cold, slick feel of the oilcloth pad beneath her. The pokey, rustling straw of the mattress. The sound of his heavy, labored breathing, already starting to sound like a death rattle. This is where the performance truly begins for her. She might make a small, calculated sound, a moan or a sigh, not of pleasure, but of professional encouragement. It's a signal, let's get this over with, It's part of the service, a bit of auditory scenery to make the client feel like he's getting his money's worth. The shock isn't just physical, it's emotional. For the man, this is the moment his fantasy collides with a brick wall of reality. The beautiful, willing creature from his drunken imagination is replaced by a still, silent woman who smells faintly of chemicals and despair. The thrilling, illicit adventure he envisioned is suddenly just a sad, awkward transaction in a filthy room. There's a moment of cognitive dissonance, a flicker of disgust or pity, but it's quickly bulldozed by the sheer force of his physical need. He has to push through the discomfort, the awkwardness, the dawning realization of the pathetic nature of the scene. He's paid his dollar and he's going to get his dollar's worth, even if it feels more like a chore than a pleasure. For the woman, the shock is the constant, jarring reminder of her own commodification. Each new man is a fresh assault on her senses and her soul. The unique, unpleasant smell of him, the specific way his weight feels, the texture of his skin. It's a new invasion to be catalogued and endured. All her preparation, the douching, the perfume, the mental walls feels pathetically inadequate in the face of this overwhelming physical presence. The illusion of control is gone. She is no longer the painter of her own face, the mistress of her small, sad room. She is simply the thing on the bed, the object upon which the man's urgent, clumsy lust is about to be spent. This first contact is a brutal, sensory overload. It's a world away from the slow, seductive dance of courtship. It's a car crash in slow motion, a messy, chaotic, and deeply unsexy prelude to the main event. It's the moment the abstract idea of buying a woman becomes the concrete, tactile reality of skin on skin, of breath on breath, in a place where joy has long since been evicted. It is the cold, hard, physical truth, and it is almost always a disappointment for everyone involved. The romance is dead on arrival, suffocated by the stench of whiskey and desperation before it even had a chance to draw a single, perfumed breath. Once the initial clumsy shock has passed, the encounter descends into the grinding chaos of the midpoint. This isn't the thrilling climax of a story, it's the monotonous, grueling slog in the middle. This is the work. It's a sustained, intimate, and deeply absurd horror show, played out in close-up with no flattering angles or soft lighting. Forget passion. This is about mechanics, friction, and the rhythmic, desperate pumping of a machine made of flesh and bone. The focus narrows to a pinpoint of pure, grotesque physicality. Let's get anatomical. This is a collision of unwashed bodies. The man, still layered in the grime of his work, is sweating profusely, the effort and the alcohol turning his body into a furnace. His sweat drips onto her, mingling with her own, creating a salty, sticky film that covers them both. The air, already thick, becomes unbreathable, a hot, humid fog of human exertion. The bed, a flimsy, complaining creature, joins the chorus. Every movement is accompanied by a symphony of squeaks, groans, and creaks from the wooden frame and the compressed straw mattress. It's a sound that offers no privacy, a loud advertisement of the room's purpose to anyone within earshot. It's the soundtrack of paid-for sex, and it's as unromantic as a factory whistle. The act itself is often a frantic, artless piston work. The man is driven by a singular, selfish goal, his own release. He is not concerned with her pleasure. The concept is likely alien to him in this context. He is a man trying to solve a biological problem as efficiently as possible. His movements are repetitive, hard, and devoid of any rhythm or grace. It's a race against time, against the ticking clock of his own stamina, against the turn he's paid for. Think of it from her perspective, the sheer, monotonous horror of it. His weight crushing her, the rhythmic, jarring impact against the lumpy, unforgiving mattress, the scratchy wool of his trousers hastily pushed down, rubbing against her thighs, the smell of his breath in her face, a sour wave of whiskey, and poor digestion. Her job is to lie there and endure it, a passive receptacle for his frantic energy. Her mind has to be a fortress. She stares at the water stains on the ceiling, turning them into maps of faraway places. She recites multiplication tables. She plans her grocery list. She does anything to dissociate from the physical reality of the man pumping away on top of her. This is her superpower, the ability to be profoundly absent from her own body. The intimacy of the act is a grotesque parody. This is the closest two human beings can physically be, yet they are emotionally galaxies apart. He is in his own world of desperate physical sensation. She is in her own world of detached mental exile. Their skin touches, their fluids mingle, but their souls are hermetically sealed off from one another. This is the ultimate loneliness, to be so physically entangled with someone who doesn't see you, who doesn't know you, and who is actively trying to use you up and be done with you. The sensory details become overwhelming. The slick, cold feel of the oilcloth pad, now sticky with sweat. The sound of his grunts, short and sharp, like an animal's. The way the candlelight flickers across his face, contorted into a mask of pure, selfish concentration. The faint taste of lead and arsenic from her own makeup, smeared by the contact. It's a full-body assault, a deluge of unpleasantness that she has trained herself to ride out like a storm. Let's talk about the pain. This isn't pleasurable. For her, it's often a painful endurance test. His roughness, the lack of any preparation or consideration, the sheer mechanical violence of it can be agonizing. Add to that the constant internal irritation from the chemical douches, and you have a recipe for exquisite suffering. But she cannot show it. Pain is bad for business. So she bites her lip, clenches her fists into the lumpy mattress, and waits for it to be over. Any sound she makes is a calculated lie, a piece of theatre to speed the process along. A faked moan of pleasure is a tool, a bit of auditory lubricant to help him reach his conclusion faster. The faster he finishes, the sooner his weight is off her, the sooner his smell is out of her room, and the sooner she has the dollar in her hand. Her performance is not about seduction, it's about efficiency. The midpoint slog is also where the absurdity peaks, the sheer comical gracelessness of it all. The man, so sure of his masculine power, is reduced to a sweaty, grunting, pumping creature, a slave to his own biology. The woman, a vessel of supposed sin and temptation, is in reality a bored, tired worker just trying to get through her shift. The whole grand drama of human sexuality is reduced to this ridiculous, sweaty, creaking puppet show in a filthy back room. There's a dark, bleak humor in it, the humor of the gallows. Two people desperately trying to get something they need, release for him, survival for her, through this clumsy, undignified pantomime. It's a human comedy at its most base and pathetic. This grinding chaos is the heart of the transaction. It's not a single, sharp moment of horror, but a prolonged, simmering one. It's the slow, steady erosion of dignity, the methodical transformation of a human being into a piece of functioning equipment. It is the long, dark, sweaty tunnel that must be traversed to get to the other side, and the only light at the end of it is the promise that, eventually, it will be over, but not yet. Not for a few more minutes of squeaking, grunting, and staring at the ceiling. Of course, in a system so perfectly designed for failure, things rarely went according to plan. The grand masculine release the client paid for often ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a fizzle, or a full-blown, humiliating catastrophe. This inevitable downfall was the anticlimax, the moment the sordid little drama collapsed under the weight of its own pathetic reality. The most common failure was a simple, biological one. Let's call it whiskey dick. The same alcohol that gave the man the courage to walk into the crib in the first place often betrayed him at the crucial moment. After all the bluster, the negotiation, the fumbling in the dark, he would find himself physiologically incapable of completing the act. Imagine the sheer, crushing humiliation of it, lying there, sweaty and exposed, in a room that smells like cheap perfume and despair, unable to perform the one function he came for. The bravado evaporates instantly, replaced by a cold, clammy shame. He has failed at the most basic test of manhood, and he's paid for the privilege of having a witness. The woman, for her part, has seen this 1,000 times. Her reaction is a finely tuned performance of professional patience, tinged with weary contempt. She might offer a bit of unenthusiastic manual assistance, her touch cold and clinical, like a bored mechanic trying to jump-start a flooded engine. Or she might just lie there, waiting, her silence a louder judgment than any words could be. The air grows thick with his failure. He might get angry, blaming her, the whiskey, the lumpy bed, anything but his own body. He might become sullen and pathetic, apologizing profusely. Either way, the transaction is poisoned. He's paid for a service he can't use. Does he get a refund? Not a chance. Business is business. He's paid for her time, and he's wasted it. He stumbles out of the room, not with the swagger of a conquering hero, but with the slumped shoulders of a man who has just been profoundly, personally defeated. Then there's the opposite problem, the race to the finish line that ends before the race has even properly begun. The man, so wound up with weeks of abstinence and a gut full of whiskey, might find himself crossing the finish line almost immediately, sometimes before he's even fully undressed. The frantic, desperate encounter he'd built up in his mind is over in a matter of embarrassing seconds. The overwhelming sensation is not satisfaction, but a sense of being cheated, of a huge build-up leading to a pathetic puff of smoke. He's left feeling hollow, foolish, and still full of a restless, frustrated energy. He paid $1 for 30 seconds of clumsy friction. The woman again is a professional. This is the best-case scenario for her. The job is done quickly, with minimal wear and tear. She might even have to feign a little disappointment to protect his fragile ego, a masterful touch of acting in this theatre of the absurd. "Oh, so soon?" she might murmur, her internal monologue screaming, "Thank God, next!" Another common downfall was the argument over money. The deal, slurred out at the bar, can become a point of contention in the soberer, colder reality of the crib. He thought he was paying for more time. She knows exactly when his 10 minutes are up. He thought a certain act was included. She informs him that's extra. The clumsy intimacy curdles into a nasty, haggling dispute. Voices are raised. The thin walls of the crib offer no soundproofing for this sordid little negotiation. His masculine pride is on the line, her livelihood is on the line. It can end with him storming out or grudgingly paying more or, in the worst cases, with violence. The illusion of a shared, if illicit experience is shattered, revealing the cold, hard cash transaction at its core. And then there was the most terrifying failure of all, the sudden, horrifying discovery. In the dim, merciful light of the candle, things can be hidden. But a sudden movement, a shift in the shadows might reveal something that cannot be unseen. A weeping sore on his body, a strange rash, the telltale signs of the pox. In that instant, everything stops. The frantic pumping, the bored endurance, it all freezes. A wave of cold, primal terror washes over the woman. She has just been in intimate, unprotected contact with a plague carrier. Her cleansing rituals suddenly feel like a child's prayer against a hurricane. This is no longer a job, it's a potential death sentence. She might recoil in horror, pushing him away, her professional mask cracking to reveal the terrified woman beneath. The man, confronted with the physical evidence of his own decay, might react with shame, denial, or rage. The encounter ends not in release, but in a shared, chilling moment of mortal fear. He leaves a walking ghost, and she is left in the dark room with the terrifying knowledge of what she has been exposed to. These moments of failure and humiliation were not the exception. They were the norm. The entire enterprise was built on a foundation of disappointment. The men were chasing a fantasy of release and power that the grim reality could never match. The women were selling a product, the illusion of willing, pleasurable sex, that they could not possibly deliver. The system was designed to leave everyone feeling cheated, used, and just a little bit dirtier than when they started. The downfall wasn't a bug in the system, it was the primary feature. It was the universe's cruel, ironic punchline to a very bad joke. In this relentless cycle of exploitation and humiliation, it would be easy to see the women as purely passive victims, helpless figures being ground down by an uncaring machine. And while they were certainly victims of a brutal system, they were not always passive. Within the tiny, suffocating confines of their existence, they found ways to resist, to assert a sliver of agency, to fight back in small, often futile ways. These were not grand rebellions or heroic escapes. They were the quiet, desperate acts of defiance of a prisoner in a cell. The most common form of resistance was economic. The entire system was designed to bleed them dry, to keep them in a perpetual state of debt bondage to the saloon owner or madam. So they learned to be thieves. It was a high-risk, high-reward game of survival. Shortchanging a drunken client was a classic move. In the fumbling, post-coital confusion, as he tried to handle his money with unsteady hands, $1 might, accidentally, be miscounted in her favor. Or she might develop the light fingers of a pickpocket, lifting a few extra coins from his trousers while he was otherwise engaged. This was more than just theft. It was a reclamation. It was taking back a tiny fraction of the value that was being extracted from her body. If caught, the consequences were severe, a beating, a fine that would plunge her deeper into debt. But the reward was a small taste of freedom, a secret victory. Another subtle act of defiance was the delivery of a bad experience. For a client who was particularly cruel, cheap, or arrogant, she could weaponize her performance. Instead of the fake moans and feigned passion, she could become a block of ice. Her silence, her stillness, her dead-eyed stare could be more unnerving than any verbal insult. She could perform the act with a cold, contemptuous efficiency that left the man feeling small, foolish, and utterly unsatisfied. She could forget to fake the orgasm, letting the encounter end in a flat, awkward silence. It was a way of saying, "You can buy my time, you can use my body, but you cannot command my spirit. You will not have the satisfaction of thinking you pleased me." It was a small, bitter power, but it was power nonetheless. There was also resistance through camaraderie. The women in the line in the saloon, they were each other's competition, but they were also each other's only true allies. They would share information, which clients were dangerous, which ones were secretly gentle, which members of law enforcement were on the take. They would share remedies for diseases, tips for faking pleasure, and techniques for hiding money. In the brief moments between clients, they would share a bottle of whiskey and a round of gallows humor, their laughter a raw, defiant sound in the face of so much misery. This shared cynicism was a bonding agent, a way of collectively acknowledging the absurdity of their lives. It was a small community forged in shared trauma, and it was a vital psychological defense against the crushing loneliness of the job. Then there were the failed escapes. Every woman dreamed of leaving the life, of earning enough money to start over somewhere new, where no one knew her past. Occasionally, a woman would try. She would save up a secret stash of money, wait for the right moment, and simply walk away. But the system was designed to prevent this. The pimp or saloon owner would often send men after her, not because she was personally valuable, but as a message to the other women: there is no escape. She would be dragged back, beaten, and stripped of her savings, her debt now even larger to cover the cost of her retrieval. Her failed escape became a cautionary tale, a public demonstration of the futility of hope. More often, the escape failed before it even began. A medical bill from the quack doctor, a sudden fine for some invented infraction, a theft by a desperate client, and her escape fund was gone. The dream would have to be deferred again and again until it eventually died, leaving only a hollow ache of what might have been. Sometimes the resistance came from an unexpected source: the client. Not every man was a brute. Some, perhaps first-timers, or men with a conscience not yet completely eroded by loneliness and whiskey, would be shocked by the reality of the crib. The smell, the filth, the dead-eyed emptiness of the woman on the bed. It was not what they had imagined. A flicker of empathy, of shared humanity, might break through their wall of entitlement. In a rare moment of grace, a man might simply turn around and leave, or he might pay the woman for her time and just talk to her, asking her name, sharing a moment of quiet, human connection in that inhuman space. These moments were dangerous for her. Kindness could be a crack in her emotional armor, letting in the pain she worked so hard to keep at bay. But it was also a confirmation that she was still a person, not just an object. These small acts of resistance, theft, and failed escapes highlight the tragic reality of her situation. She was not a mindless drone. She was a human being, constantly, quietly, fighting for a scrap of dignity in a world determined to strip her of it. Her defiance didn't change her circumstances. It didn't lead to a happy ending, but it proved that even at the bottom of the deepest, darkest pit, the human spirit still flickers, however faintly, refusing to be completely extinguished. Just when you thought this grim, sweaty transaction couldn't get any more complicated or unpleasant, the universe would often decide to throw in a wild card, an unexpected element that would escalate the situation from merely awful to truly, memorably bizarre. This wasn't a narrative twist for dramatic effect. This was the chaotic, unpredictable nature of life at the absolute fringes of society, where the normal rules of cause and effect seemed to break down. The most common wildcard was an unexpected arrival. Imagine the scene, the rhythmic creaking of the bed, the grunts of exertion, the whole sordid ballet nearing its clumsy conclusion. Suddenly the flimsy door to the crib bursts open. Standing there, silhouetted against the brighter light of the saloon or the alleyway, is a figure who has no business being there. Perhaps it's the man's wife. She's tracked him from the saloon, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. The sordid little scene of paid-for lust is instantly transformed into a domestic drama of the highest, most humiliating order. The man, caught literally with his pants down, freezes in a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. The prostitute becomes an unwilling supporting actress in a play she never auditioned for. The wife's rage isn't directed at the prostitute. She's just a symptom, a piece of human filth. The rage is for him, for his betrayal, for the public shame he has brought upon their family. The air crackles with a new, much more dangerous kind of tension. The encounter ends not with a whimper, but with screaming accusations and the very real possibility of public violence. Or maybe the figure in the doorway isn't a wife, but a rival. Another cowboy, drunk and belligerent, who thinks this particular woman is his for the night, or who simply has a grudge against the man currently on the bed. The conflict over the woman's body becomes a proxy for a larger masculine feud. Fists fly. The tiny crib becomes a cage for a clumsy, brutal fight. Furniture is smashed, bodies collide, and the woman is trapped in the middle, trying desperately not to become collateral damage. Her workplace has just become a war zone, and her only goal is to survive until the combatants stumble back out into the alley. Sometimes the wildcard was an institutional one, a sudden, unannounced raid by a new, zealous town marshal trying to make a name for himself, or a posse of moral crusaders from the local temperance league, armed with Bibles and self-righteousness. The door is kicked in and suddenly everyone is caught, in the glare of lanterns and judgment. The man faces public arrest and shame, his name plastered in the local paper. The woman is also arrested, but for her, it's just a temporary inconvenience, a business expense. She'll spend a night in the drunk tank, pay a fine, which goes right back into the town's coffers, a neat little circular economy of sin, and be back in the same crib the next night. The raid does nothing to stop the trade, it just adds a layer of farcical performative chaos to it. The escalation could also be medical and deeply personal. The man in the midst of the act might have a sudden catastrophic health event, a heart attack from the exertion and the alcohol, an epileptic seizure, a drunken fall that results in a serious injury. The prostitute is instantly transformed from a service provider into an unwilling first responder. She has a potential corpse on her hands in a business where death is very, very bad for marketing. Does she call for help and bring the authorities down on her? Does she try to drag the body out into the alley and pretend it never happened? The sordid transaction has morphed into a life-or-death crisis, a logistical and moral nightmare of the highest order. Then there were the truly bizarre rituals. A client might not just want a straightforward physical release, he might have a specific, strange fetish that he needs to play out. He might want her to wear a particular item of clothing, or to say specific phrases, or to act out a bizarre, scripted scenario. These requests could range from the comical to the deeply disturbing. The woman had to make a quick calculation. Is this weirdness worth the $? Is it just strange, or is it dangerous? She became an improvisational actress in the theatre of deviancy, her ability to play along a key part of her professional skill set. This wild card element served to constantly underscore the precarity of her existence. She had no control. Her room could be invaded at any moment. The man in her bed could be a threat in a dozen different ways. The law was not her friend. Her body was not her own, and even the small, contained space of the crib was not a sanctuary. It was a porous, vulnerable stage where any number of horrors could, and often did, wander in from the wings. These escalations shattered the monotony of the job, but replaced it with a sharp, unpredictable terror. It was a reminder that at the bottom of society there is no safety net. There is only the long, hard fall, and the chaotic, random chance of what you might hit on the way down. The wild card wasn't just an interruption, it was a confirmation of the fundamental chaos that ruled her world. The frantic energy has subsided. The client, whether satisfied, humiliated, or interrupted, is gone. The play is over, but the stage needs to be cleared for the next performance. This is the aftermath, the quiet, grotesque landscape left behind. The tone is not one of relief, but of bone-deep exhaustion and hollow, mechanical routine. The first thing to deal with is the body, her own. The immediate aftermath is a ritual of triage, a desperate attempt to wash away the physical and psychic residue of the last encounter. She stumbles out of the lumpy bed, her limbs aching, her skin sticky with a film of sweat and semen. The first destination is the washstand, the grimy altar of her profession. She pours the cold, murky water from the pitcher into the basin. It's the same water she'll use for the next 3 or 4 cleanups, a cloudy soup of past encounters. She takes a coarse rag and begins the methodical, loveless process of cleaning herself. This isn't a sensual cleansing bath, it's a scouring. She scrubs her skin raw, trying to remove not just the physical fluids, but the lingering touch of the man, the memory of his weight and his smell. Then comes the dreaded syringe. She fills it with the caustic, burning solution, carbolic acid, mercury, whatever poison she's chosen as her shield, and performs the internal cleansing. The sharp, chemical sting is a familiar pain, a self-inflicted punishment that she has convinced herself is a form of protection. It's a moment of private, solitary agony, a testament to her terror of the invisible enemies of disease and conception. She is literally burning herself out from the inside, a slow, chemical form of self-immolation, all in the name of being able to do this again in an hour. While she tends to her body, her eyes scan the room, assessing the damage. The bed needs to be looted and reset. She smooths the cold, slick oilcloth, wiping it down with the same dirty rag. If there are sheets, she checks them for money. A desperate or drunken client might have dropped a coin in his haste. Finding one is a small, secret victory. She pulls the sheet taut, trying to make the lumpy straw mattress look vaguely inviting, a task akin to putting lipstick on a corpse. The floor is next. She might have to clean up a spill of whiskey or vomit, or blood from a bar fight that spilled into her room. She does it quickly, dispassionately, with a handful of sawdust from a bucket in the corner. The smell of fresh sawdust mingling with the permanent odors of the room is the scent of a fresh start, a new, clean slate for the next round of filth. The air itself needs to be cleansed. She might light a piece of cheap incense or burn a scrap of paper, the smoke a futile attempt to combat the thick, human stench that clings to the wooden walls. She reapplies her own mask, a fresh layer of the cheap, cloying perfume on her neck and wrists, a touch-up of the lead-based powder on her face to hide the flush of exertion or the pallor of despair. She looks into a small, cracked piece of mirror, not to admire her reflection, but to check the product. Is the mask still in place? Does she still look like the commodity she's supposed to be? The emotional landscape is a vacuum. The high-alert state of her mind during the encounter recedes, leaving behind a profound emptiness. There is no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment, just a hollow quiet, the silence of a factory floor after the machinery has been shut down. This is the most dangerous time for her, the moment when the walls of her mental fortress can crumble. The numbness can give way to a wave of disgust, of shame, of pure, soul-crushing despair. This is when the bottle of whiskey on the stand becomes a tool, not of seduction, but of medication. A quick, burning swallow to push the feelings back down, to rebuild the wall before the next client knocks on the door. This is also a time for a grim accounting. The dollar, or whatever the fee was, is now hers. She might hold it in her hand, feeling its weight. This small metal disc is the physical manifestation of what she just endured. It is her survival, her food, her rent, her poison. She has to decide what to do with it. Does it go to the pimp to pay down her endless debt? Does she hide it away, a tiny contribution to an escape fund that may never be filled? The coin is both her salvation and her damnation, the symbol of her ongoing captivity. The aftermath is a cycle, repeated 10, 15, 20 times a night. It's a blur of bodies, fluids, and cleanup, a relentless, soul-destroying loop of defilement and restoration. It is the work behind the work, the unseen, unglamorous labor of erasing the past to make way for an identical future. The room is quiet now, reset, waiting. In the flickering candlelight, it looks almost peaceful. But it's the peace of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, littered with the invisible casualties of a war that never ends. The only thing left to do is wait for the sound of the next pair of boots in the hallway. The immediate physical cleanup is one thing. The slow, creeping rot in the mind is another entirely. The main event might be over in minutes, but the psychological scars accumulate layer by layer until they form a thick, calloused armor over the soul. Surviving the night was a victory, but surviving a lifetime of nights required a fundamental rewiring of the human spirit. Coping wasn't a matter of healing, it was a matter of managing a chronic, incurable condition. The most immediate and pervasive psychological scar was a profound and permanent sense of dissociation. To endure the constant physical and emotional invasions, a woman had to perfect the art of not being there. She lived next to her body, not in it. Her physical self became a tool, a piece of equipment she operated with detached, professional skill. But this schism, while necessary for survival, was a wound in itself. It led to a pervasive feeling of unreality, a sense that her life was a movie she was watching from a great distance. The world became flat, muted, drained of color and emotion. Joy, love, tenderness, these were alien concepts, things that happened to other people in a world she could no longer access. This emotional numbness was her primary coping mechanism. She couldn't afford to feel pity for a client, anger at his cruelty, disgust at his smell, shame for her own actions. These were all dangerous sparks that could ignite the highly flammable tinder of her trauma. So she smothered them. She developed a hard, cynical shell, a deflective shield of sarcasm and world-weariness. The gallows humor she shared with the other women was a vital part of this. Laughing at the sheer, grotesque absurdity of it all was a way to keep from screaming. Their jokes were dark, brutal, and deeply specific to their trade, a private language of the damned that no outsider could understand. He was so drunk he couldn't find his own way home, let alone the right spot on me. Paid me $1 to listen to him cry about his wife for 10 minutes. Easiest money I ever made. This humor was not a sign of happiness. It was the sound of scar tissue forming. When numbness and humor weren't enough, there were chemical aids. Alcohol and opiates were not recreational drugs. They were essential workplace tools, as vital as the syringe and the wash basin. A bottle of laudanum, a cheap, readily available tincture of opium, was a common resident of the bedside table. A few drops could take the edge off the physical pain, but more importantly, it could blur the sharp edges of memory and despair. It could help her sleep through the noise of the saloon, through the nightmares that replayed the worst moments of her job. Whiskey served the same purpose. It was a liquid anesthetic for the soul. Many women became functional, or not so functional, alcoholics and addicts. It was a rational choice in an irrational world. The slow, creeping poison of addiction was a preferable alternative to the sharp, immediate agony of feeling the full weight of her reality. The trauma manifested in other ways too, a constant, low-grade hypervigilance. She was always on alert, scanning for threats, reading the subtle cues in a man's posture or tone of voice. Was he angry? Was he violent? Was he sick? This state of high alert was exhausting, leaving her perpetually drained and on edge. Sleep, when it came, was rarely peaceful. It was haunted by a revolving door of faceless men, by the phantom sensations of their touch, their weight, their smell. The fear of disease was a constant, gnawing anxiety, a form of psychological torture. Every itch, every ache, every unusual discharge was a potential sign of a death sentence. She became a reluctant expert in the horrifying symptoms of syphilis and gonorrhea, studying her own body with a mixture of terror and clinical detachment. The psychological toll wasn't limited to the women. The men, too, were scarred, though in different ways. The constant use of prostitutes could hollow out a man's capacity for genuine intimacy. It taught him that sex was a commodity, that women were objects, and that his own needs were paramount. It could create a deep, cynical rift between his public self, who might be a husband and father, and his private self, who frequented the cribs. This hypocrisy could curdle into a deep-seated contempt for all women, or a profound self-loathing that he would drown in whiskey or bury under a mountain of bravado. The trauma was a shared contagion passed back and forth in the dark, infecting everyone it touched. For the woman, coping was a return to the bleak routine. The morning after a particularly brutal night was not a time for recovery. It was a time to get up, perform the chemical ablutions, paint on the mask, and prepare to do it all again. The routine was its own form of coping. The repetitive, mindless tasks of cleaning, dressing, and waiting were a way to structure a life that felt fundamentally chaotic and out of control. It was a way to get through the day without thinking too hard, about what the day entailed. The lingering trauma was a ghost that lived in the room with her. It was in the stains on the mattress, in the smell of the carbolic acid, in the face of every new man who walked through the door. It was a constant, silent companion, and the only way to live with it was to pretend it wasn't there, to numb it, to laugh at it, or to simply, stubbornly outlast it. The personal traumas, the individual cycles of lust and disgust, didn't happen in a vacuum. They were the engine of a much larger, dirtier machine that powered the entire town. The societal ripple effect of the Wild West sex trade was profound, shaping the economy, public health, and the very legal and social fabric of these burgeoning frontier communities. It was a filth that oozed out from under the crib door and stained everything it touched. The most immediate and devastating ripple effect was a public health crisis of epic proportions. Syphilis, the Great Pox, was a silent, creeping plague. In an era before antibiotics, a syphilis diagnosis was a slow, agonizing death sentence. It moved through the town like a phantom, passed from a lonely cowboy to a prostitute, who then passed it to a traveling salesman, who took it home to his wife in another town, who might then pass it to their unborn child. The brothel was the central hub, the grand central station for venereal disease. The so-called medical inspections forced on the women were a farce, often conducted by quack doctors who were more interested in collecting their fee from the pimp than in actual medicine. The cures were as horrific as the disease itself. Mercury was the treatment of choice, a heavy metal poison that caused tremors, tooth loss, and madness. Patients would be slathered in mercury ointments or forced to sit in heated boxes, breathing in mercury vapor. The cure was often just a faster, more excruciating way to die. The towns were filled with the walking wounded, men and women with the telltale rashes, the open sores, chancres, the shuffling gait of neurological damage, syphilitic ataxia, and the creeping dementia of the disease's final stages. Everyone knew someone who had it, and everyone was terrified of getting it. This fear permeated every aspect of social life, creating a culture of paranoia and suspicion. Economically, the brothel was not some fringe enterprise. It was often the central pillar of the town's economy. The saloon and the brothel were a symbiotic entity, a one-stop shop for male recreation. The money a miner or a cowboy earned went straight from his pocket to the bartender, and from there to the prostitute, and from her hand directly into the pocket of the saloon owner. This cash then flowed out into the rest of the town. The saloon owner used it to pay the butcher, the baker, the blacksmith. The women, on the rare occasions they had money of their own, spent it at the general store or the dressmaker's shop. A significant portion of the town's prosperity was built, quite literally, on the backs of these women. This created a profound and deeply hypocritical dependency. The respectable citizens, the churchgoers and town councilmen would publicly decry the sin and vice of the red light district, but privately they knew the town's economy would collapse without it. They were profiting, directly or indirectly, from the very thing they condemned. This led to the creation of laws that were designed not to eradicate prostitution, but to regulate and profit from it. Towns would create red light districts or restricted zones, ostensibly to contain the vice. In reality, this was a zoning plan for sin, making it easier to manage and tax. The police force, funded by town taxes, would then collect fines from the prostitutes and saloon owners, which was essentially a licensing fee for their illegal business. The law wasn't a tool of morality, it was a tool of revenue generation. The cycle was perfectly closed. The town profited from the sin, the law collected its cut, and the whole rotten enterprise was allowed to continue under a thin veneer of civic order. The social crusades that periodically swept through towns were often more about political theatre than genuine reform. A fiery preacher would whip up a frenzy, leading a mob of righteous citizens to raid the brothels. But these were temporary storms. After the public performance of morality, the brothels would quietly reopen. the fines would be paid, and business would resume as usual. The Crusaders could feel good about having cleaned up the town, while the town fathers could rest easy knowing their primary source of revenue was secure. The most tragic ripple effect was, of course, the next generation. Pregnancies were a constant terror, but they happened. A child born to a prostitute was born with no name, no status, and no future. These children were the ultimate collateral damage of the system. Some were abandoned on the steps of the church or left at the town orphanage, destined for a life of stigma and hardship. Others were raised in the brothel itself, a truly horrific childhood spent witnessing the grim realities of their mother's profession from the earliest age. These children, particularly the girls, were often groomed to enter the life themselves, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. They were the living, breathing evidence of the town's hypocrisy, a problem that most respectable citizens preferred to ignore. The brothel was the town's septic tank, a place where all its ugliest impulses were contained. But the tank was leaky, and the filth seeped into the soil, poisoning the groundwater of the entire community. It created a society built on a lie, a place that preached piety while profiting from sin, a community that consumed its most vulnerable members to fuel its own growth. As the years passed and the frontier slowly gave way to something resembling civilization, a strange and pernicious thing began to happen. The brutal, filthy, and desperate reality of the Wild West sex trade began to be rewritten. The raw, open wound of history started to scar over, and the scar tissue formed a story that was smoother, cleaner, and infinitely more palatable than the truth. This was the bitter legacy, the methodical, almost willful, transformation of horror into romance. The process began with language. The crude, transactional terms of the era were replaced with a softer, more evocative vocabulary. The whore, or the prostitute, became the soiled dove, a term dripping with a kind of tragic, poetic beauty. It implies a creature that was once pure but has been stained, a victim of circumstance who retains an innate, bird-like fragility. The crib became the boudoir, the saloon, her back room, became the pleasure palace. The very words used to describe the business started to build a gilded cage of myth around it. The characters in this rewritten history were sanded down and polished into archetypes. The prostitute was no longer a desperate, often diseased woman trapped in a cycle of debt and abuse. She was reinvented as the prostitute with a heart of gold. This is a crucial and deeply insidious myth. In this version of the story, she is cynical and world-weary on the surface, but deep down she possesses a profound moral compass and a wellspring of kindness. She is the one who helps the down-on-his-luck hero, who protects the innocent, who has a wisdom that respectable society lacks. She chooses her life, or at least accepts it with a wry, knowing smile. Her suffering is noble, her sexuality is a source of power, not shame. She is not a victim, she is a renegade saint. The client, the unwashed, desperate cowboy, was also given a makeover. He wasn't a man buying a moment of squalid release. He was the rugged, lonely individualist, the hero of the American frontier. His visit to the brothel wasn't a pathetic act of desperation. It was part of his wild, untamed nature. It was an expression of his freedom from the constraints of polite society. The transaction wasn't about him using her. It was about two lonely souls finding a moment of connection in a harsh world. Their encounter was framed as a kind of battlefield truce, a brief respite from the brutal realities of the West. The environment itself was sanitized. The filth, the stench, the disease, all of it was scrubbed away in the retelling. The Hollywood saloon became a place of vibrant, exciting nightlife, not a stinking den of alcoholism and violence. The prostitute's room, in the movies, is often surprisingly plush, with velvet curtains, a soft-looking bed, and maybe even a vase of flowers. The grim reality of the lumpy straw mattress and the basin of cloudy water was replaced by a set designer's fantasy of Victorian opulence. This rewriting of history served a vital psychological purpose. It allowed a nation to look back on a foundational period of its history without having to confront the ugly truth of the exploitation that built it. The myth of the Wild West is a story about freedom, individualism, and manifest destiny. It's much harder to celebrate that myth if you acknowledge that it was built on, among other things, the systematic sexual exploitation of women. The sanitized version allows us to have our cake and eat it too. We can celebrate the rugged cowboy without having to think about the woman he used and discarded. This bitter legacy is a form of collective gaslighting. It takes the lived experience of thousands of women, their pain, their fear, their suffering, and tells them, and us, that it wasn't that bad. In fact, it was kind of romantic. It was an adventure. It silences the victims by appropriating their stories and turning them into entertainment. The reality was a world of chemical burns from mercury douches, of agonizing death from syphilis, of debt bondage that was a hair's breadth from slavery. The legacy is a story of sassy heroines in corsets trading witty banter with handsome heroes. The chasm between the two is a monument to our profound capacity for self-deception. We tell ourselves the story we need to hear, the story that makes us feel good about where we come from. And the truth, in all its squalid, inconvenient detail, gets buried in an unmarked grave, right next to the thousands of women whose real stories were never told. The final bitter irony is that the women themselves sometimes participated in this myth-making. An old, retired prostitute, writing her memoirs, might romanticize her past, glossing over the worst of the abuse and focusing on the moments of camaraderie or dark humor. It was a way to make sense of a life of trauma, to frame it as a story of survival and resilience rather than one of pure victimization. It was a final, desperate act of taking control of a narrative that had, for her entire life, been brutally out of her control. So we've taken a long, hard crawl through the muck. We've seen how the romantic myth of the Wild West saloon girl was a lie, a perfumed cover-up for a reality of filth, disease, and brutal economic coercion. We've witnessed the grim chemical rituals of preparation, the squalid environments designed for profit over people, and the soul-crushing transactions that left everyone feeling cheated. We saw how this system was not a fringe activity, but a core economic and social engine of the frontier, poisoning public health and built on a foundation of profound civic hypocrisy. And we've seen how, in the end, history itself performed the final act of cleanup, scrubbing away the blood, the sweat, and the tears, and replacing it with the comfortable, sanitized lie of the soiled dove and the noble gunslinger. The horrific reality of a woman's body being treated as a human spittoon was transformed into a tragic romance, a story we could sell to ourselves and each other. But here's the final bleak punchline. Are you ready for it? This isn't just history. That business model, the one that relies on stripping a human being of their context, their humanity and their future, reducing them to a simple, easily consumable function for a low price, it never went away. It just changed its clothes. Look around. Think about the gig economy worker, the one delivering your food in the rain, treated not as an employee with rights, but as an independent contractor, an interchangeable node in a logistics network. Their health, their financial security, their exhaustion, it's all externalized, just like the prostitute's was. The app on your phone is the new saloon owner, taking its cut, setting the rates, and ensuring the worker remains in a perpetual state of precarity, always hustling for the next low-paying gig. The platform provides the illusion of freedom and flexibility, while in reality, it's a high-tech version of debt bondage. Think about the relentless pressure of consumer culture, the one that tells you a product can fill the void of your loneliness, that a purchase can deliver a moment of genuine happiness. The transaction is quick, the relief is temporary, and the emptiness always returns, demanding another purchase, another fix. We are all, in our own clean, modern, well-lit ways, paying $1 for a 10-minute solution to a lifetime problem, chasing a fantasy of satisfaction that the product can never truly deliver. The core mechanism is the same, creating a desperate need and then selling a deeply inadequate, often harmful, solution. The Wild West crib was just a beta test for a much larger, more efficient system of turning human needs and vulnerabilities into profit. We've just gotten better at hiding the filth, at making the transaction feel seamless and clean. We've replaced the lumpy straw mattress with a sleek user interface. So here is my final, uncomfortable question for you. As you sit there in your comfortable modern world, so far removed from the stench and the desperation of that 19th century room, what romantic lies are you telling yourself right now? What brutal realities are you conveniently ignoring so you can enjoy the cheap, easy transaction right in front of you? Because the soiled dove never really disappeared. We just stopped calling her that. Now we call her content or convenience or progress. And we are all, every single one of us, her loyal, paying customers.